Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Politics of Latin America and the Caribbean. I am Dr. Nicole Warmington. This week, we'll be looking at neoliberalism and Latin America. With that, we'll be discussing what is neoliberalism, why it emerged in the region, what effects it had on countries in the region, discuss who benefited and who lost, as well as discuss how politics changed afterwards. So let's start off by defining what is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism actually argues that free, unregulated markets best allocate resources and provide social welfare. Its core beliefs are that the market should dominate economic life, that the state should be minimal, that public spending is often seen as inefficient, and that privatization and deregulation are preferred. Now, the role that the state plays in neoliberalism is as follows. The state is supposed to protect property rights and enforce contracts, provide only goods and services that the market cannot provide. Now, the key policies that fall under neoliberalism are privatization, deregulation, free trade, cutting social spending, eliminating the idea of the public good. So the core idea that we get from neoliberalism is the idea of markets over government. Now, why did Latin America embrace neoliberalism? And the main reason has to do with that it gained traction in the 1980s and 1990s due to the debt crisis. We saw the debt crisis happening in the 1980s. Prior to that, there was massive external borrowing in the 1970s. You saw where Mexico and Brazil suspended payments of such debts that they had in 1982. The debt actually skyrocketed from $105 billion in 1976 to $397 billion in 1986. Now, in order to cover this, you found that to refinance these debts, countries turned to the World Bank and the IMF. These institutions actually required that states practice structural adjustment programs, and these included budget cuts, privatization, and trade liberalization. So it's important when we look at Latin America that neoliberalism was not purely ideological, but it was imposed through financial pressures. Other major prescriptions that we know that neoliberalism offers is that states are to sell all the state-owned companies. They were expected to privatize social services, reduce tariffs, deregulate capital flows, cut subsidies, and also launch aggressive anti-inflation campaigns. The presidents that were largely associated with neoliberal reforms when instituted in the 1980s and 1990s were Fernando Henrique Cardoso in Brazil, Carlos Menem in Argentina, and Carlos Salinas and Ernesto Zedillo in Mexico. Now, what were the immediate economic effects of neoliberalism? The first immediate effect was that we saw hyperinflation halted, particularly in Argentina and Brazil, foreign investment increasing across the region, and we saw Latin America being labeled as an emerging market. Following this, we saw an increase in the number of trade agreements that were signed across the region. The most prominent ones that we know are NAFTA, which was signed between Mexico, United States, and Canada in 1994. And this was central to Mexican neoliberalism. And then there's Mercosur, that was formed in 1991, but didn't have its institutional structure until 1994. And this was formed between Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. We also saw the rise of maquiladoras, which were assembly plants that used low-wage labor, particularly women. They had weak labor protections, they suppressed wages, and they also limited worker rights. There were also social and cultural effects, or should I say social and economic consequences of neoliberalism. For those who benefited, It tended to be middle-class consumers because they now had access to lower-priced imports, foreign investors, and financial sectors. Those who lost were local producers, workers in protected industries, and the poor. And they actually faced a lot of problems. We saw the collapse of domestic industries, the rise of unemployment, reduced social services, increased inequality. So the main theme we see coming out is that stabilization that came from neoliberalism did not equal equality. So we saw where neoliberalism improved the macroeconomic stability, but it deepened structural inequality. Now, Chile has always been used as the success story of neoliberalism in the region. Reforms or neoliberal reforms actually started under Pinochet after he overthrew Allende in 1973, and he started taking advice from the Chicago boys. By the 1990s, after following these reforms, we saw where Chile had low inflation, diversified exports, steady growth, and strong credit ratings. However, one thing that was noted is that wealth distribution remained highly unequal. So as a success story, the key takeaway is that we see that growth happened without equity. Now, given all of these problems associated with neoliberalism, there was resistance to it. We saw opposition movements springing up, which included the Zapatistas in Mexico, the Shining Path in Peru, as well as indigenous movements across Bolivia. These groups actually demanded national sovereignty, social protection, and indigenous and civil rights. So what we saw happening across the region is that we saw neoliberalism clashing with strong traditions of nationalism. Now, eventually, we saw the collapse and crisis of neoliberalism in the region. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, we saw Mexico facing the 1994-1995 peso crisis. Argentina collapsed in 2001 and defaulted, and poverty and homelessness surged. We saw public frustration growing, and neoliberalism began to lose legitimacy. What happened afterwards is that it ushered in what is known as the pink tide. So in the 2000s, many countries shifted towards nationalist or left-leaning governments. And the characteristics of these governments were as follows. They were anti-imperialist in their rhetoric. They had active state intervention. They did not, however, fully reject capitalism, but they also attempted to mitigate all the harms that may have been caused by neoliberalism. So what you found is this marked a political pendulum swing, back towards nationalism. While all this was happening, however, Mexico and Colombia remained more liberal. Now, how did this change Latin American politics afterwards? After neoliberalism, there was greater skepticism towards globalization, a rise in populist leaders, increased social spending in some countries, continued inequality challenges, and persistent debate over the state versus the market. So the core tension remains across the region. And the question with that is how to balance market efficiency with social justice. So when we look at it, some of the major themes that we see across neoliberalism in Latin America and the Caribbean is that neoliberalism emerged from crisis. It was driven by debt and IMF pressure, as well as the global economic restructuring. It actually stabilized economies, but deepened inequality. So macroeconomic gains came at a high social cost. It also transformed politics. It triggered black backlash, nationalism, and the pink tide. So if there's any takeaway you should have in looking at neoliberalism in Latin America and the Caribbean, is that we know neoliberalism shaped Latin America by stabilizing economies and integrating them into global markets. But it also intensified inequality and social exclusion, fueling political backlash and the return to state-centered politics. Thank you.